Good morning. It's great to be here. I was at this conference last year. What I'm going to talk about for about 15 minutes, it tells me it's 8:45, so I'm on time, is the research we've been doing for the last couple of years on workforce ecosystems. So I'm a co-author along with three other amazing people. I will share this deck with you in a PDF format. So please don't hesitate to take photos. I think we also have a box of about 40 books that are coming that will be available. We didn't have books for everybody, but hopefully you can grab a book. If you want to get a book, it's available pretty much everywhere you want to get it. It's not an Audible. I have people who say they only listen to books if they can get it on Audible. So we have a team that has been working with MIT Sloan Management Review and Deloitte Consulting. I was a partner at Deloitte Consulting for 20 years, retired a couple of years ago. Now I teach at Columbia Business School, and I also work as a vice president of Gloat, which is a talent marketplace, skills foundation, and a career marketplace platform. Liz Altman is our lead author. She's an academic associate professor at UMass Lowell. David Kieran has one of the coolest titles I've ever heard. He's the head of the Big Ideas program at MIT Sloan Management Review. And Robin Jones is the partner at Deloitte Consulting who leads their workforce transformation practice. We started a set of research in 2019. And Deloitte has been working with the MIT Sloan Management Review for about 12, 13 years now. And we pivoted the work. We did about 5 years of research on the maturity and the development of digital organizations. And then in 2019, we pivoted to a multi-year series of research on the future of the workforce. And in the first year of the research, we focused on talent and opportunity marketplaces. We were looking at how companies were using market dynamics inside their organizations, in addition to sort of hierarchy and bureaucratic ways of moving around talent. And then in the second year, we brought on board Liz Altman, who was not a workforce specialist at all. Liz is an academic researcher on ecosystems and ecosystem strategy. And we began to look at the workforce through the lens of ecosystems and ecosystemic questions. I didn't even know ecosystemic was a word. And all the research that we have here, and again, we'll share this with you, all these reports are available for free, either on the MIT Sloan Management Review website, or I think they're available free on the Deloitte website because they were funded and published by Deloitte. So if you're interested in any of these topics, we did a series of reports, again, first on talent markets, then on workforce ecosystems, then on managing workforce ecosystems, which I'll talk about in a second, and a number of infographics. And we started this work, this research that we did over the last 4 years. We did 3 global surveys of about 5,000 people. We interviewed, I think, about 100 executives around the world. And we started with the question, when I say workforce, who and what do you think about? We actually said, who do you think about? And then soon the question became, who and what do you think about? And of course, the starting point was, well, when we talk about our workforce, we mean our employees. And then we would say, so your workforce is your employees. And people would say, well, no, not just our employees. It also includes all of our contractors and our gig workers and our freelance workers. We would say, so that's it. It's your employees and your freelancers. They'd say, well, no, it includes all of our subcontractors and all of our service providers. It includes, this was a very interesting category to identify, it includes complementary businesses, complementators. Right? The easiest example for me when I think about this is to think about all the content providers that are in all the app stores is a really good example. These are people that do work that benefits either Apple or anybody who has an app store, the Android app store. They don't get paid by them, but they share their revenue with them. It's billions of dollars of revenue. I think it was like $8 or $9 billion at Apple the last time I looked at it. And from some perspective, they are part of the workforce. It includes market sellers. Again, Amazon being the best example of this. And of course, and this is one of the things we heard, I think we first heard it from NASA, who said, oh yeah, when we talk about our workforce, we mean our people and our machines and our robots and our chatbots and our AI. And just to put another point on that, one of the things that we all actually saw in the last few years is we began to issue something that looked like an employee ID to software bots. Because the only way that a software bot could access our SAP system or any other system was those systems were set up where access was organized around actually having an employee ID, right? So this very interesting dynamic where people with all sorts of employment contracts and all sorts of employment relationships and technologies are all on the workforce. So what do we mean by a workforce ecosystem? I've sort of given you one view of it, which is, think of this, and you'll see this on the bottom half of this slide. There's this continuum of employees, contractors, gig workers, service providers, complementators, and technology. And we have a sort of, again, I worked with, the other three authors are all PhDs. I just have 2 master's degrees, so they kept reminding me of the fact that I wasn't a PhD. And the definition that we have sort of are putting out there is that a workforce ecosystem is a structure. It's focused on value and value creation for an organization. It includes internal and external workers, people in and beyond the organization. And everyone is pursuing both individual and collective goals. And what we're really trying to understand are the interdependencies and the complementarities of the participants. This is the workforce in the 21st century. Right? And the more that we, it's like when you hear a new phrase and then suddenly you hear that phrase everywhere. When we began to think about the workforce as an ecosystem, we saw in almost every company and public sector and not-for-profit organization we talked to that their workforce actually is an ecosystem, generally with the company or the organization at the center. The book's organized in 3 different sections. First, we try to define what is a workforce ecosystem. Then we talk, and I'll talk about this in a moment, what does it mean to manage a workforce ecosystem? We call this orchestration because you don't manage an ecosystem the same way that you manage an organization, perhaps. And then we also look at the implications of this. We look at ethical implications, we look at public policy implications, and then we sort of muse in a final chapter about what does it mean when ecosystems become the unit of analysis for the way that we think about these questions. As we were doing this research and we were talking with companies around the world, we developed, we're management consultants. We tried to get it into a 2x2 framework. We couldn't do that. So we came up with a hexagon. The funny story about the hexagon is every time we drew it, we wanted it to be standing on its edge with one point at the bottom, one point at the top. The graphic designers kept putting it on the flat edge. We said, no, you can't put it that way. Because we're trying to communicate something about who the stakeholders are, right? And sort of right down the center is a senior leadership and a managing leadership executive dimension, right? This really is driven by the senior leadership seeing the organization as an ecosystem and managers actually being incented. This is not a small issue. We certainly know this at Gloat as we implement talent and career marketplaces. The incentives and the management practices need to be organized so that people are thinking and incented around management practices. I call it the shoulders. The sort of top part of the hexagon is connecting HR or people operations and procurement, right? These are 2 groups that for the last many, many years, certainly probably since the late 1940s, have all been hiring and managing people, but they've been in 2 different worlds, right? And we think in the same way that we see this continuum of employees, contractors, and technology, there needs to be a continuum and a connection between what's happening in HR and what's happening in procurement. I'll come back to that in a second. And then the knees, as I describe it, of the model is connecting IT and finance and legal so that all of the different support enabling functions are actually thinking about this. And then we took 4 cuts at this. We thought about at the very center, how do management practices change, right? And when I talk about management practices, in HR and employee management, we have a very strong mental model of how management practices are set up. We think about attract, develop, retain. Everything is built on an employee life cycle, not an ecosystem life cycle, an employee life cycle. So we literally, in a couple of chapters of the book, say, how do management practices, how are they changing? Not how should they changing. Everything we've reported on in this book is already happening in organizations around the company. What do management practices look like? The simplest example is recruiting is moving from an attraction focus to an access focus. How do we access talent in the organization and outside? And how do access management practices differ from attraction and retention practices? We then looked at technology enablers, and I'm going to double click on this in a second. What roles does technology play in a workforce ecosystem? And a very important part of that is what we call verification and credentialization tech. So I'll come back to that. That's sort of how I'll end this morning's discussion. And we looked at integration architectures, which is a fancy academic way of saying governance, right? How do we govern this thing, right? Who's involved in governance? What does the board do? What do the executives do? What does that shift look like? And then, of course, finally, how does leadership itself change when we're in a world of ecosystems, not in a world of traditional talent management? Let me give you one example. We have many examples in the book. This is one of the reasons it was so much fun to do this research. As I mentioned when I started a few minutes ago, we would start with this question, so who is your workforce? What is your workforce? And I think over time, about 87% of the people that we talked to and surveyed said, you know what, it's not just our employees. It is this much broader group of people that are engaged with us and machines. And there's a wonderful set of stories from Novartis. People, I think everybody should, hopefully you know Novartis. It's a big pharmaceuticals company based in Switzerland. And they define their workforce as anyone who contributes to executing work toward our purpose and our business strategy. So if you just think for a moment about pharma, they work with a lot of universities, they work with a lot of research institutes, a lot of work done as part of clinical testing and clinical trials is not done by Novartis employees, people with a Novartis badge. It's done by other people, and they have about, and hopefully I won't get the numbers wrong, right, they have about 50,000 employees and about 100,000 people in their ecosystem who have other employment relationships. And what they've been looking at is how do they pull together their disparate systems to enable them to actually orchestrate their workforce ecosystems, and what are the differences? It's changed how they look at talent acquisition, talent management. It's changed the way that they think about the data that they have, obviously. And it's also pushed them to think about working in real time. And as I was talking with John Healy about just before we started today, it also got them to think about how work itself is changing, right? How work is no longer just a job. The job is not necessarily the unit of analysis, but work is being pixelated, it's being disaggregated. Work is also being broadened. Work is being projectized. So how do we look at work being pulled in those two different directions? Hopefully you can see this. It's actually pretty big on the screen here. One of the things that we explore in the book is we try to reframe what is going on in workforces and workplace tech. For many years, actually, I'm about to go today to Josh Burson's conference in California. Josh is a very good friend of mine. I supervised his practice when they worked with us at Deloitte. For many years, we've been trying to sort of cram all of this technology into the HR tech stack, right? And what we're suggesting is that the HR tech stack now really needs to be reframed, right? And this is the way we're thinking about the reframing. First, we're thinking about the fact that we're not just looking at employees, we're broadening the scope to include every worker with any type of employment relationship to the company. The other thing we're looking at is moving beyond a transaction and a compliance and reporting focus, which of course is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So what we're introducing is an expansion from enterprise to ecosystem and an expansion from transaction to development, growth, and experience, a much more dynamic layer of what's going on in work. So when I think about, if I think about where Gloat, for instance, sits on this chart, we're in the upper left-hand corner. We provide skills and analytics and talent and career marketplaces for employees working in the enterprise. And what we're looking at now is how do we expand that even further. To make it even more interesting, but not to make it more complicated, we think that there are 5 things going on now in the ecosystem technology space. And I'll end by talking about number 4, which is really what we're talking about here at this conference. There's work tech, right? Work tech are the technologies that we use to actually do our work, right? It could be a spreadsheet, it could be a digital surgery tool. It could be a lot of the AI tools that we're developing right now with ChatGPT. It basically gives us a superpower that we can extend the work we do as individuals and teams. There's workforce tech, and this is workforce tech, right? Well, by workforce tech, we're looking at both the transaction tech and the development, the growth, the experience tech that's there. There's workplace tech. I don't really even need to say very much about that. When we started talking about it a couple of years ago, it was sort of off to the side. We're using workplace tech to be able to work in the same place. We'll work in a distributed fashion. We can work synchronously. We can work asynchronously. We can put on goggles and play with the HoloLens or the metaverse and all those pieces. Then there's credentialization and verification tech. I'll come back to that and I'll close on that. And then there's technology actually as a part of the workforce, right? We're actually seeing that technology is not only being used as a tool and assistant, but technology is being used as a colleague. Some of the work is done by us, some is done by a machine. And what's very scary to some of us is that in some ways, technology is also working as a manager. It's assigning work to people. Again, the most obvious example of that is the way ride-sharing programs work. It used to be, and this is a US dated reference, when you called a taxi, that you called a number and there was a dispatcher. And the dispatcher would say, who's near the Cornell Tech campus who can pick up a ride and take them to JFK, which is where I'm going later this morning. Of course, now when I leave the conference, I'll just put that into my phone and an algorithm will tell a driver what is the opportunity and that person will come and pick me up. But we literally, before this conference, when we were thinking about workforce ecosystem enablers, identified this category of verification and credentialization tech. We talked with Dror, we talked to some of the commercial companies that are looking at this area, and our thinking is, as we're looking at the way workforce ecosystems is playing out, it's a critical part of this whole story. Either we do it as a commercial venture, and we're seeing a whole bunch of closed proprietary systems come up, or we have an open network, a blockchain like we're talking about here at Velocity Networks. And sort of I'll sort of end with this comment. What I've tried to do in a very brief keynote this morning is introduce the idea that if we look at the way work is evolving in the 21st century, work is changing, jobs are being broken apart, we're working in different places, we're constantly learning, we're constantly reskilling, we're constantly fulfilling the aspirations of individuals. That's the University of People example. It's a wonderful example of that. We're trying to develop people to have the skills for things that are changing in real time. My favorite example of that is prompt engineers. If you're trying to recruit prompt engineers today, good luck. The best way to find a prompt engineer is to develop prompt engineers and to find the adjacencies and the interests in your companies. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Work Disrupted, and the theme of that book, which I think fits very well with the theme of this conference and what we're doing, this Congress, is that in the 21st century, we need new maps and mental models, right? And in some way, I don't want to say we're trapped by old models in the same way that we think of talent lifecycle as attract, develop, retain, and it's becoming access, grow, and engage, that a career is no longer a 3-box model, learn, work, retire. It's a portfolio of multi-directional moves, of constant reinvention. And the opportunity for us right now is to think about what are the new maps that we need. So I love this quote from Albert Einstein: you can't use an old map to explore a new world. In some sense, I think, Dror, Eitan, we are in a sort of map-making phase now. We're sort of charting new directions. That's part of what we're trying to do with workforce ecosystems, which is really help us to do this reframing and this thinking. And I just couldn't put it more directly than say, the technology world in an ecosystem world cannot survive and thrive without this layer, without this whole set of platforms around verification and credentialization tech. And I think I've used my 15 minutes and a couple more, but thank you very much for letting me present this morning. Yeah, I'm happy to take some questions if we have time. Or alternate speeches is the other thing that I've heard somebody say.
Talk about human-machine relation. Like there's a whole new concept developing there, right? A new psychology, maybe a new mental.
Yeah. So the question, if everybody heard, is what about human-machine collaboration, and what are the mental models that we need for that? Well, it's interesting. I don't know if it's that new. I think it's become more pronounced in the last 6 months since the ChatGPT announcements. But we've been looking at human-machine collaboration for many, many years. There's some great research on this. I'm a huge fan of Tom Malone, who teaches at MIT, who wrote a book called Superminds. I think he wrote it in 2018, 2019. And one of the ways that there are many ways to think about it. Here's one way to think about it, right? Tom lays out 4 relationships that people have with machines. He talks about machines as tools. He talks about machines as assistants. I mean, a tool is like a spreadsheet, but once you put in a spreadsheet that has a prompt in it, it's actually helping you do the work, like autocomplete, we might call a tool. We can look at technology as a colleague, as I mentioned, and we can look at technology as a manager. I think another maybe more interesting, compelling way that we're thinking about it right now is, do we see technology and humans in competition? Is technology and AI, for instance, and robotics, an automation and a substitution play? Is it an augmentation play where we're actually giving employees and teams superpowers, or is it collaboration? Tom uses a wonderful expression. Sometimes we've heard for years, we're trying to find a way to put humans in the loop. Tom says, I don't know if I want to put humans in the loop. I'd rather put technology in the group, right? And so one of the challenges we have today is, are we thinking about people and technology through a substitution, a competition lens? By the way, Darren Acemoglu and his partner, they just wrote this fabulous book on prosperity and technology. And Darren, who's also teaching at MIT, has a great phrase. He says, the worst kind of AI is automation. And what he means by that is we create the least amount of value when we simply substitute technology for what humans do. The most value we create is when we figure out a way that when machines do what they do and people do what they do, it's truly not only additive, but it's truly accretive, right? I think that's the real challenge that we have, and we're seeing it play out right in front of our eyes right now with ChatGPT, because on the one hand, we see ChatGPT as, here's work you don't need to do anymore because a machine can do it. The more interesting and the harder part of this right now is the reimagination of work, the redesign of work, the re-architecting of work, right? It's not how can we do the same thing and produce the same output. It's actually more than productivity, right? Sorry, the economist in me says productivity is a very simple equation. Productivity is more of the same output with less human input, right? But value is when we actually do something new in addition to doing more of what we're doing. So I think over the next few years, we're trying to figure out what do these human-machine groups look like, and how do we use it not just to substitute what we're doing, but really to get into a value creation piece. It's it's become the issue in front of us right now for the next few years, is that reimagination piece.
Please.
What are you seeing about employers in the same domain or segment and their willingness to share information about basic requirements for jobs and job roles and skills? There's the assumption that for competitive reasons, employers won't want to divulge information about even the most basic aspects of their workforce. And I'm wondering about that because there's this concept of skill frameworks that are publicly available, maybe shared among employers in a certain segment. Are you seeing any action on that, or what are your thoughts?
Well, this is a really big question because large language models have almost entirely disrupted this model, this paradigm. I think my perspective, I won't, as a researcher, I'll put it that way, but also working with a lot of startups, and I know all the HR tech companies, is that standard models for skills and competencies will become almost meaningless, right? Because large language models will make all that information not only available to everybody, but will also help us understand the relationships between skills and work and interests, right? I think, again, John and I were talking about this earlier, we are seeing a shift. Let me take a step back. We've been using the job as this unit of analysis for like 100 years, right? And a job is we take the work that we want to do, we standardize the process, and then we create a set of standard jobs, which are a collection of tasks that are largely organized around common processes, right? And that's sort of the way we've been doing it for about 100, 150 years, right? Now, as I mentioned a second ago, jobs are being disrupted and pulled in two ways. They're being broken up into smaller pieces. Some of those pieces can be done by machines. Some of them can be done through microtasking. Some of them can be done by shifting them around in the organization. But work is also becoming, I think this is a very important dimension, it's being projectized, right? So what really becomes interesting in terms of workforce strategy is what is the work you want to do? What are the projects that you want to do? And how can you, in a dynamic way, put together the teams of people to do that work, right? Also recognizing, and this is why I think the standard models become less important, there aren't enough people today, there will never be enough people again in the world, this may be a better way to put it, who will have the skills to do the work that we want to do going forward. Because the work that we're doing is constantly and dynamically changing. Right? So in order to do that work, we need something like a marketplace dynamic. That's why the talent markets and the ecosystem models, I think, are so interesting. To say, here's the work that we're doing, and here's the work that we want to do in the future. Right? And in order to do that work, we have to identify through a skills lens who has the skills to do that work. Even more importantly, we're looking at adjacent skills. Who is close to having the skills that we're looking for? And what are the ways that we can help that person close those gaps? That's why the University of People is such an interesting concept to me. The other thing we're looking at is what do people want to do and what do we want people to do? Right? So again, where I'm really coming from is the more dynamic the model, the less useful standard models are. Right? Now, we will need to have standards in some way. This, to me, is why credentialization and verification is so interesting, because if we can verify and credentialize the skills that you have, and we can have a clear, visible path to where you got those skills, I'll give a specific example. We may not know what project management is going forward. We can argue about it, but we know that if you got a project management certification at Deloitte Consulting, which is where I was a part of 20 years, that means something, because we know what it means to be a manager at Deloitte Consulting, right? We know what it means, or if you have a PMI certification, we know what that means, right? It may not be exactly what we're looking for, but it is close enough for us to actually leverage that experience. So it becomes a much more complicated and nuanced game. And this is where, and I'll end with this, I know Ollie's looking at his watch, which he should. some of the technology we have is trying to do skills-based analysis through databases and tables, right? And I don't think it's a database and table question anymore, right? I think it's a data and an analytics, and it's a matching, and it's a prediction, and it's a pattern recognition piece, right? But it's also an aspirations piece, right? And this is where I don't want to say I have a criticism of skills-based work, but my colleagues at Deloitte developed a whole skills-based organization strategy, and Mercer's got a skills-powered strategy. I mean, we're all looking at that. The challenge is skills and aspirations. The challenge is the work that we're doing today and the work that we want to do in the future, and how do we create technologies and practices that help us do that. You've been very generous with your time. I'll be around for a few more minutes. I apologize. I am leaving to go to LA. We'll share this with you. I think there's my contact information here. Thank you for having me this morning.